welcome to SilviCast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Greg Edge.
And I'm Brad Hutnick.
And we are both silviculturists with the Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your hosts for today's show.
I am not sure what to do with this new pup. Soupy eats like a pig, and look at he looks like a basketball.
Who is Soupy, Brad? I thought it was Seneca.
Yeah, that's his kind of real name, or the name but Soupy, that's his nickname, because when he was born, he was the last pup born in an outside run. It was cold. It was November. And the breeder had gone inside, and his mother had one more pup. For some reason, the breeder came back out, and Soupy, or Seneca, had already crawled like 2 runs away, and he was kind of stuck, and he was kind of cold and almost, like they didn't know he was alive. Yeah, so he brought him in, and then he put him in warm water, and he said, I literally had him on the stovetop in warm water, and then he came back to, and life was good. So we say he was making soup. So he survived making soup.
He's Soupy. Okay,
he's
got
Soupy.
It. Okay. Yeah. Well, and you think Soupy's too big?
Yeah, I think he's huge, and it's not.
He looks normal to me.
But it's not worms. I mean, he's had all his shots. I give up.
He looks fine to me.
But now check this out. I started a spreadsheet with his weekly weigh-ins.
Well, that's disturbing.
No, don't be too hasty. And next I plotted out Seneca's weight trajectory over the next year. And let's just say at this pace, I think he's going to be about 113 pounds. And that, my friend is that's like a Jurassic Springer. That's huge. That's huge.
That's an interesting theory, Brad. I think you'll probably have to get a bigger kennel for one thing. And maybe you should get some expanding collars, made out of bungee or something. I don't know. But at least on the bright side, we'll be able to see him coming through the cattails out in South Dakota. He'll be like King Kong parting the cattails coming through the forest. That'll be cool.
I'll be riding him through the cattails. I'll be waving to you from the middle of the cattails, Greg. No, this is not right. And I'm going to have to put him on a diet or something.
Well, I don't think this is how it works, Brad. You're letting your short-term observations cloud your long-term perspective. So what do they say in the stock market? Short-term gains may not reflect long-term performance, something like that. I think this is a lesson our guest on SilviCast today may be able to help you with. So today on SilviCast, we're going to be talking with Dr. Bernd Blossey, professor at Cornell University, about his interesting and sometimes controversial work with garlic mustard, earthworms, and deer. So I think Dr. Blossey will agree, Brad. You have to keep an eye on the long term.
That's cool. Hey, Soupy, leave it. Drop. I got to get this out of his mouth. This season of SilviCast is brought to you by the Nelson Paint Company, McCoy Construction and Forestry, and the Family Forest Carbon Program. You make the SilviCast world go round, so thank you. Dr. Bernd Blossey, welcome to SilviCast. For our audience members who may not be familiar with you, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you work, and what you do.
Well, right now I'm a professor at Cornell at the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. I came to North America in 1992 following some insects that I released to control purple loosestrife. Initially I was an insect caretaker after having done my PhD on purple loosestrife in Europe, and I kind of got stuck at Cornell. Not a bad place to get stuck.
No.
I then followed up and worked in wetlands with purple loosestrife. And at some point, I got into the forest because people said, hey, what you did with purple loosestrife, maybe we can repeat that for some big forest invaders. And we have a couple of target species, which includes garlic mustard that we will be talking about. So I did that. But important for me was trying to understand what these species that people considered problems in the woods or in the wetlands, what they did to the environment, whether that was to plants or to insects or to birds or whatever it is. So I tried to develop assessment protocols to better understand what these organisms are about and what problems they may create. The other part then was following up and trying to understand when we released these insects, which we did on loosestrife, what would happen to the wetlands and how would plant communities respond, or amphibian communities and bird communities. So I'm very broadly interested. I like conservation. I like to work across different trophic levels. So that's what I have been doing, both in terms of non-native species management and in measuring their impacts, as well as trying to teach people how to use biological control and implement it on their own and do their own assessment program. So that's what I have been about for the last 30 plus years.
Cool.
Bernd, sometimes we like to go back and we like to ask our guests how you first got interested in all of this, kind of the ecology of these systems, and, why did you decide this was something you wanted to study?
Serendipity strikes again, right? So when I was going to graduate school and thinking about, what do I want to do for later on in life? I initially wanted to become a marine biologist. This goes way back, So I went to the University of Kiel because they had a polar research station. And I said, that's really cool. I want to do that. And so I did that for a little bit, went on boats and dredging on the forest floor, dredging the sea floor, looking at what comes out. But the problem always was you needed a boat to get out and do these different things. And at the same time, we had a couple of entomologists and ecologists that were going out, taking our first semester students on little excursions into the woods, going to ponds and doing all these little things. So I got fascinated more by that. So I still have a degree in ocean chemistry, but my big interest then switched to insects and plants and other things. And when I was thinking about what would I be doing for a useful degree, I thought, I don't like all the pesticides that people are spraying all over the place in agriculture or others. And my parents were big organic gardeners. So why don't I try to do some pest control? And there was this institute in Switzerland at that point called the Abbey Commonwealth Institute for Biological Control. So I got there and got a summer job rearing insects and parasitoids on big Lepidopteras. I had no idea that there was such a thing as weed biocontrol, but the station was divided into forest entomology, agricultural parts where I was rearing little cabbage moth parasitoids, and then the weed section, and worked a lot with North America. So I was there summer and part of the winter, and at some point, the leader of the weed science section came to the coffee table. It's a British thing. 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, you have coffee. Everybody gathers around the table. And he said, hey, is there anybody interested in doing a master's study? There is money coming from the US for purple loosestrife biocontrol. And I very shyly raised my hand. Can I take a look at that?
Yeah.
And so I did. And so that's how I got into the purple loosestrife. They wanted a person working further north because loosestrife is more common in the north. Finland, Scandinavia, other places. So I spent my PhD driving from southern France to central Finland, looking at insects on purple loosestrife. Sounds more exciting than it actually is because you spend a lot of time.
Well,
yeah.
And I had a VW van with a microscope, and that was before the EU was really established, and I had to cross a lot of international borders with purple loosestrife, potted plants in the back that look a little bit like weed. You can imagine what that did. So it was great fun. So there's a lot of excursion into the back. So I got interested in doing non-chemical control, right, of problem species. That got me into weed biocontrol, but I had always been interested in big issues of conservation. Doesn't matter whether it was wetlands or forest, but that drove me to what I'm doing now. And I didn't have like a specific focus, whether it was plants. While I have an entomology degree, was dabbled in limnology, all the water insects. I was fascinated with birds and mammals. So that allowed me to look at this system in more complexity than just picking out a portion of it.
We were just talking about problem plants, and I think a lot of our listeners are familiar with invasive species or interfering vegetation, and you've worked with a lot of them, and you've researched in particular one that I think we wanted to talk about today, garlic mustard. For those who may not be familiar with it, could you tell us a little bit about garlic mustard, and maybe even how it got here, why we're dealing with it.
Yeah, I wish I knew how it got here.
Yeah.
And that's still a mystery. It got here, I think, in the 1860 to 70. Was initially found in Long Island. According to herbarium records, it then spread across the country, did some long distance shops, maybe even with horticultural soils, or I don't think people really transported it, it's more accidentally. Now, if you look in, you can find pesto recipes. One of my former graduate students liked to take the seeds and bake it into bread. It's a little spicy because there's some mustard oils in it or so, right? So it spread, had these satellite colonies established and then filled this in between. And now it's through much of the temperate North America and even into Alaska, and likes the more moist situations and dappled woods, but can occasionally go out into full sun as well, but it doesn't like it as much. So that's the background. It's a biennial plant. Seeds are germinating very early this time of the year, or April, as soon as the snow is gone. Snow is melted here. I don't know it's melted where you are today.
Mm-hmm.
So then seeds start germinating that overwintered, and then the plant makes a rosette in its first growing year. Then it overwinters, and then it bolts, produces flowers and seed, and the plant dies. So we call it a biennial species.
I always think of it as one of those species that's just visually dramatic. When you see a woods full of garlic mustard, it looks completely different than, say, like, if you were familiar with that woods and then you saw it with it, it would strike you like there would be a reaction to it.
Right. And so early on, when the plant arrives, seeds arrive typically, right? The plant doesn't arrive, the seeds arrive somehow.
Right.
Because it has a certain threshold for how many days, and I forgot what the days are. The seeds need to have a cold period, so they need to be stratified to then germinate. Early on, when there is no seed bank, you get this visual effect that one year you have lots of garlic mustard, the next year is only a rosette. Then the year after that, you have lots of flowering plants again, and then there's an empty year. Over time, if you have a longer residence time, that kind of levels out a little bit, right? So you have rosettes and flowering plants. And so that dramatic effect that you are describing is only there at the beginning of a colonization phase. It doesn't persist, and those large populations don't persist. That's what we will be talking about.
When Brad and I were reading up, getting ready to talk to you, I think we read that you have said something like your experience with garlic mustard has been a bit of a roller coaster.
Yeah.
And kind of where I became familiar with you was reading about these long-term monitoring plots and research that you became involved in particular around biocontrols around garlic mustard. You started to have observations about those monitoring plot systems. Could you tell us a little bit about that long-term research, what it was, and then what changes did you start to notice while looking at that data?
Yeah, so I'll tell you my personal experience first, because that's what triggered it all, right? So we have the luxury of having 350 acres of woods and meadows here where we live. And garlic mustard was well established when we bought this property, right? Old farm with woodlands around it. And so my wife and I said, well, we can't have this happening. We need to do something about it, right? So lots of people will probably be in the same boat. So what did we do? Since I don't like herbicides, we spend our weekends pulling and schlepping out garlic mustard by the bag loads, right? Only to not really make a difference. And so frustrating as it was, we tried to, if we can't do it, how can we tell people to control it, right? So let's keep on going. But at the same time, we couldn't obviously go everywhere where garlic mustard was on our property. I had a couple of students try to do some research projects here on ground beetles. But one place that we left alone, we realized as garlic mustard was marching in and it was going down a hillside, that where it initially started, the plants became shorter and shorter and shorter over a short period of time, while where garlic mustard was just arriving, these were like 3 feet tall, right? 3, 4, 5 feet tall plants, really vigorous in the good soils that we have. So what's going on here? So that was one of the observations that we had. Well, something is not right. And we started doing follow-up experiments. But at the same time, we had money from what is called SERDIP. It's the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program to develop biological controls. So kind of trying to repeat what we did with purple loosestrife. We gave money to that place where I spent the summer, Cavi Bioscience in Switzerland. And they looked at all the European insects that feed on garlic mustard and found a whole bunch of interesting weevils. But I told you early on that we wanted to understand what would happen when garlic mustard comes in. We also wanted to understand what the dynamics of the plants are. We talked about this alteration of rosettes and flowering plants. So we established long-term monitoring locations in anticipation that we would bring in insects. And then we could understand how these dynamics without the insects would differ from when we would bring in insects. So we established these long-term plots in various places. And because this was a collaboration with lots of different natural resource agencies, people established their plots themselves, right? That they monitor. We can't be all over the country. We needed to have our collaborators. And so there were people in New Jersey and New York and Illinois and Ohio and Indiana and Wisconsin and Minnesota that tried to follow what we did. We held workshops and said, do this, measure the plants, measure the stem density, how tall do they get? We had plants shipped to us to look whether there are insects in them and stuff. So that's what we did. So we had this long-term monitoring going on while we were trying to control it by hand here and making our observation that garlic mustard was declining in vigor where it had been established for longer periods of time. And so we said, we need to understand a little better what is going on here, what's happening. We did some experiments. Why would they decline where they had been longest? And why would they still thrive where they just colonized or arrived? And there's a thing called negative soil feedback. Your listeners that are gardeners will know something about it. You do crop rotation when you farm or when you garden. You can't put a tomato where you had a potato the last year, right? Same Solanaceae group. And so each plant builds up a little microbial community around its roots, based on what it exudes into the soil. And there are certain organisms that can be suppressing these plants, right? So that's why you can't put a tomato after a tomato after a tomato, because it will not grow very well. It's not because the nutrients are leached out, but it's because there are bacteria or fungi or something else, microorganism in the soil that selectively control this particular taxa or plant. And so we said, maybe that's happening for garlic mustard. We don't know. So the way that you assess that is you take soil from where garlic mustard has a long residence time, where a short residence time, or where garlic mustard has not arrived. Then you plant this out, you grow garlic mustard in it, and half the soils you sterilize, let's say with an autoclave or something like that. So what the autoclave would do, it would eliminate all the negative soil feedback, all the microorganisms, would not do anything to the nutrients a little bit because it kills organisms, right? You put something into an autoclave, everything is nuked. And so nothing is surviving. And then you grow these plants in these different soils. And sure enough, what we found was garlic mustard can grow really well in the sterilized soils or where it hasn't been. But if there's a long residence time of garlic mustard, a few years, those plants will be suppressed. It will be short, maybe just less than a foot tall with a couple of flowers, maybe a seed or so. It's not completely eliminated, but most of the time the rosettes will die if you grow with seedlings. So that was then our observation that something is happening here. So we had experimental data, and then our long-term monitoring was also showing us, hey, these plants, we tried to establish these long-term assessment plots where garlic mustard was really thriving, right? Lots of garlic mustard. That's where we would do biocontrol. That's where we put our permanent quadrats out. And over time, they were losing garlic mustard. Garlic mustard was not completely going away. In some places it was, but over like a decade, garlic mustard was basically gone from these plots. Even at, say we were at at the school or at a park or something like that, garlic mustard was still there, but it wasn't as abundant as when we started. And so that then over 10, 12 years, what we put into this paper showing the declines are everywhere. Little different dynamics in different places across the country, but basically the declines were everywhere. The declines, though, didn't happen. That goes back to my initial story when my wife and I kept on pulling garlic mustard. It kept on coming back with a vengeance. We just couldn't find the time to do enough. And there were soil, seed banks, and things. So garlic mustard just came back. If you start pulling out garlic mustard, you take the food away for the microorganisms that need that plant roots and the things that they excrete to build up their populations. If you pull out garlic mustard, you clean this, not like an autoclave, but the plants will be coming back. So those pulls that people have, we will have a garlic mustard challenge probably in Michigan in a couple of weeks. They go to the same places year after year after year after year. And garlic mustard just comes back with a vengeance. If you control it, it will beat you. If you take away and just sit on a park bench and watch it, it will go away by itself. So that's our experience, both here at home and with the data that we looked at. So we have garlic mustard on our property in some little abundance where it doesn't make a big difference. But most of the places that we started to control and then we walked away from, no garlic mustard left, or a couple of plants here and there.
Is there differences across sites? Like you said, there are some differences across those plots in terms of is it different if the forest is a degraded forest versus different forest canopy covers?
I wouldn't have enough information to say what is a degraded forest, right? So what we also know is garlic mustard can only thrive where you have earthworms. And what these are the European earthworms, where you in Wisconsin now also have the jumping worms, right? So that
unfortunately,
spreading through Wisconsin initially with the native plant exchange. I remember those discussions. So garlic mustard is not the driver of this deterioration that we don't like in our forest. It follows earthworm invasions, and then deer eliminate a lot of the competitive plants that would keep out garlic mustard. So there is a combination of these stressors. So what you call degraded, Greg, I don't know what that means. So if
it could mean a lot of things, actually.
Yeah. So if you have a degraded forest where garlic mustard has an easier time establishing there, then when you have an intact forest with lots of leaf litter in there, garlic mustard just can't germinate very well when the leaf litter is thick. And so it's just not happening. But once established, the dynamics also differ, and there's not enough work to understand whether conifer forest is different from a deciduous forest versus a mixed forest. So that could require some more work, but we know that those dynamics where garlic mustard disappears happen wherever people have looked, whether that's here in the US or whether it's in Canada. Those dynamics are the same.
Do you think that disturbance could play a role in longevity on a site? And I'm thinking of, say, a timber sale. If you had a timber sale that came through an area where you've got the seeds in the seed bank, you don't really see them right now. Might there be a brief explosion after something like that?
Oh, absolutely, Brad. You aid disturbance, right? You walk, whether you cut, you have more light. If you have machinery in the woods, there will be some soil disturbance. Even a tree falling and being uprooted, there's a disturbance, right? All of those things will expose new soil, will get garlic mustard growing again. But then the decline is very rapid after that. So even in the places where we had the initial observation that plants come in, be tall, and then they shrink, I have a couple of trees fall, garlic mustard comes back, and there are some annual dynamics, and garlic mustard never 100% goes away. There's always some ups and downs, but it's never at these densities that we early on see where you can have 100 stems per meter square or something like that, right?
Yeah.
We don't get that anymore, and it really is not an issue. It's more something where I feel it's in our heads. Our emotions say, we have been told this is the destroyer of the woodlands. And you need to just emotionally step back and say, hey, this is not quite true. Even the evidence that we have, Garlic mustard doesn't do all the damage to the woodlands. It's something different. So let it be. You will be happier in the long run. That doesn't mean that you don't have ups and downs like with every other plant.
Looking for continuing education credits? Check out the SilviCast webpage for more information. And now, back to our show. Greg, I was just thinking of a situation. Early in my career, I was involved in doing a lot of prescribed burns. And I remember one site we did where we came back afterwards, and it may have released the seed that was in the seed bank, but it was just solid with garlic mustard afterwards.
Yep.
Which then we wound up, and this was a long time ago, we wound up having to go back and spray it.
But you eliminated the leaf litter, right? So you had bare ground. That's ideal conditions for garlic mustard germination.
Yeah.
Like that mineral soil, which you just created, the perfect seedbed for them.
I want to go back to the worm connection. But before that, Brad, maybe while we're still talking about garlic mustard, I think you came up with some of your rapid fire true false questions.
Yeah.
For Bernd, and maybe this is a good time just because those are kind of overarching around garlic mustard.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, well, anyways, we can talk about these as we go, but sometimes we hear things, and so it's good to, as long as we've got you here, we can spit them out at you.
Clear up the rumors.
That's right.
I may use more than one word to answer your question, though.
That's right. Oh, yeah, you can answer however you want. Yep.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. So, true or false? Garlic mustard negatively impacts wildlife. And you could qualify wildlife however you want.
Yeah, I need to do a little more.
Yeah.
And the general answer will be no. Okay. So if we think about rodents or other mammals or birds, the answer is no. And so, but you could have, if the garlic mustard has the high stem densities, there may be an inability for an ovenbird to build a nest for a few years in that particular patch, right? Or the foraging is limited. But it would be the same if you have bracken fern there or any other dense plant, maybe a physical obstacle for a little bit. And then garlic mustard, because it's senesces so early, maybe even earlier than some of the other spring wildflowers, there may be a little thing that some shelter disappears. I don't know, but there's no evidence to suggest that it's garlic mustard that drives that. We have done our experiments and long-term assessments with salamanders. Garlic mustard has no influence on salamanders. It's the worms that have the influence, right?
Yeah.
So while we think we just study garlic mustard, we study other effects at the same time. Less leaf litter layer, less abundance of invertebrates, and we blame it on garlic mustard when actually the culprit is something different that we didn't think about early on. We didn't think about that as well. That's why we started the biocontrol program until we then realized, garlic mustard is not the driver here. It's something else.
Yeah.
So sorry, no true or false, but mostly false.
Mostly, yeah. Well, that's a given. So, okay, so how about this one? True or false? Garlic mustard causes decline in plant diversity.
False.
False.
That's clearly false because we have the evidence for that. And it comes from Fermilab, not too far away from where you are. And it's actually, we published that. And so Victoria Nuzu did that work when she was still in Illinois. And so she was looking at the plant community at Fermilab. And Fermilab instituted, based on her work, a deer cull. But during that time that she had her long-term monitoring plots at Fermilab, garlic mustard invaded. And you had the typical thing that I described, an increase in garlic mustard and then a decline in garlic mustard. No change in the plant diversity associated with garlic mustard, as garlic mustard was coming in and then declining throughout that time. Once the deer cull was implemented, and they did it early enough that they didn't lose of their native plant diversity, they just got more abundant, more cover, taller, all those aspects. So garlic mustard and negatively affecting plant community, absolutely not. It's the deer that drive it. It's the earthworms that drive it. Garlic mustard doesn't have an effect. You may not see your native plants under the garlic mustard when it's like 3-4 feet tall, but it's still there. and it's the deer that consume a lot of the native plants. It's not garlic mustard pushing them out. It's not a competitive effect.
Okay. And you might have mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth going again. True or false, earthworms are a necessary precursor for garlic mustard.
Yes.
Yep. I'm curious, why do you think that is? Or what's the interaction there?
Okay.
That's
I
not
would
true or
love
false,
to know.
Brad.
Yeah, I know. I know.
I would love to know. So a quick answer is when earthworms come in, they basically eliminate a lot of that spongy little layer that the northern forests are that typifies the northern forests, right? So it's the spongy layer, and garlic mustard germinates better on mineral soil. So that seems to be the association. Whether that's the only thing, I do not know. And maybe things earthworms also do better when garlic mustard is there, right? So there's some kind of an interactions that we don't fully understand. We don't have the mechanisms down. We have the data to show earthworms do better in garlic mustard. They favor garlic mustard. Garlic mustard favors earthworms. So they like each other somehow. So that it's not a mutualism or anything of that sort, but so we don't know exactly what it is.
Yeah.
But the strange thing on top of that is deer favor earthworms. And so that was just published from northern Wisconsin. And we initially discovered that in some of the work that we did here in New York. Again, I don't understand what the relationship is, because how would you link earthworms and deer, right? So what's the link other than they live in the same forest or so? We think it goes through a microbial link once again, maybe with defecation, urination, or something of that sort, but we don't fully understand that.
Okay, and last one before we kind of maybe get to the deer and earthworms a little bit more. True or false, garlic mustard inhibits tree mycorrhizae and tree regeneration?
True for the first one, but temporarily. False for the second part, because you have two questions in the one that you try to do, right? So
okay,
when garlic mustard comes in early on and the plants are tall, they have a lot of, like a mustard compound, it's called sinigrin, and they exude a lot of that sinigrin. That may damage some of the mycorrhizae, right? That are very close to garlic mustard, that may interfere with some nutrient uptake for some other mycorrhizal plants. Most of our forest understory plants, the native ones, are mycorrhizal. But over longer periods of time, we have places where garlic mustard has been for a long time. And we had these dense populations. There are now trillium meadows, so all kinds of native plants are there. Oaks are regenerating. Everything is regenerating. It may be a temporary effect, and it could be an effect that you can recreate in a potted plant experiment. But long term, the dynamics is not driven by garlic mustard. So the oaks will grow fine, while the other forest trees will grow fine. As long as you protect them from deer, they will become saplings. So short-term effects.
So I think we should circle back to the worm thing.
Yeah.
The worm and the worm garlic mustard deer connection. So we don't know precisely what that connection is between earthworms and the garlic mustard. So are there sites where we do not have earthworms and we have not found garlic mustard?
You go through northern Wisconsin, where we work, as I said before we started this conversation. There's no garlic mustard in northern Wisconsin that I know of. It's moving through the agricultural forests up north, right? Will it get there? I do not know. But we've worked at 50 different locations in northern Wisconsin where the wolves are present to look at trophic cascade work. I haven't seen a single garlic mustard there. I actually haven't seen a lot of non-native plants there. Maybe a little bit. Maybe I've seen some honeysuckle, but I don't even know that. On roadsides, of course, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's much lower invasives load in northern Wisconsin.
Yeah.
I mean, it's growing in places, and we certainly have earthworms because those were introduced, but they continue to spread.
Yeah, we have looked at them, and they have a strong influence on breeding birds. Some of the common ones that would sit on the forest floor or forage on the forest floor, nest on the forest floor. We know that the earthworms are doing some damage there.
Mm-hmm. Earthworms, logically, to me, they turn over that leaf litter, they expose mineral soil, so they make those conditions much more suitable for the spread of garlic mustard.
And other introduced plants, right? So you probably have microstegium somewhere in Wisconsin by now, Japanese stiltgrass.
One place.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's coming, right? And so
yeah.
What I can tell you is from long-term work that we did here in New York, and some old deer exclosures that people put up. We working at West Point for some of the military academy here in the Hudson River Valley for some of the work that we did. They had old deer exclosures up there, and microstegium went up to the fence and not on the inside. Very few worms on the inside, and microstegium didn't follow. It's a similar thing as with garlic mustard, right? So it follows the deer and it follows the earthworms. If they are not there, it can't invade. So one of the protective things that you can do is lower deer populations, and then you're not going to get so many non-native plants, including garlic mustard and microstegium. Once again, the mechanisms are a little unknown, but the patterns are well described. It's not just us having described that, but other people have found the very same thing.
Yeah, so you're saying that pattern of earthworms, invasive species, whether it's garlic mustard or something else, and then deer kind of driving that system, that pattern holds in more than just garlic mustard.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't hold for everything, right? So I'm not saying you take the deer down to some very low level and you're never going to get any other non-native species. You will still get the vines and probably the honeysuckles or something else going in. But over time, if you get your forest floor recovering because the earthworms are going down, when you have fewer deer, you have fewer ticks and less Lyme disease and all these other wonderful things that we would enjoy if they are not existing, or at least not in that abundance. So there's something to be said of increasing forest health, if you want to call it that way. It's a term that's also not very well defined, but we can increase forest health by reducing the deer.
Yeah. And I'm curious, so you're familiar with European forests and North American forests. How do they differ in that maybe, like, say, the earthworms are native in Europe, but not here? And is there a difference in the diversity of plant species, or just something else fundamentally different that would cause a different effect, having all those things in the same place?
Brad, it's like a funny thing because I wasn't aware of earthworms and deer when I was running around in the woods in Germany, right? So it all came much later. Well, I remember, so I'm doing some storytelling because it's a conversation here, right?
Yep.
I hated that there were no earthworms in the boundary waters when I went fishing up there with my friends from Minnesota. What the hell? Why do we need to bring in leeches and need to get minnows to... Where the hell are the earthworms? Well, it's good that they're not there. And so when we started working with garlic mustard and looking at garlic mustard expansion and invasion and what it would do to the salamanders, one of my postdocs at that time, John Mertz, he recorded all kinds of other critters that we would find under coverboards, which is basically a meter times 50 centimeter plank of maple wood that we put on the forest floor, and the salamanders are hiding under that. And so at that time, which was like early 2000 or so, I finally became aware that earthworms are not native to North America. I didn't know, well, at least not this part of North America. There are some native earthworms further south and further out west. Mm-hmm. So, but in the systems here, northern hardwood forests, there are no native earthworms. They're all introduced from Europe and from Asia. And so I also didn't understand the effect of deer on forest. When I came to Ithaca, I said, oh, this is what, forests in North America look like. Reading the forest history, the clear cutting that happened, the regrowth of the forest, all of those things took some time for me to actually try to understand and then link to what I was seeing in the landscape. So after having had that experience, going back to Germany, visiting family, going around in the forest, that allowed me a very different look. So of course I've looked at what the forest soils are looking like. But the problem in many European forests, particularly the ones that I'm more familiar with in Germany, is, hey, it's beech forest, something very different. These are several hundred-year-old beeches, very different tree diameters that than what you have here, where around us, finding a tree that's 150 years old is, oh my God, that's almost like an old growth tree. Well, it's a teenager for an oak or so, right?
Right.
And then we have high deer abundance in the European forests. It's not whitetail, it's red deer and roe deer and some other introduced ones. And so they're creating the same problem in the forest understory. No shrub layers, no forest floor, the herbaceous ones decimated. So we have the same effects. And so there's no leaf litter. But most of the trees in Germany are at least adapted to not having this thick, spongy layer on the forest floor. They are not necessarily obligate mycorrhizal species, right? They love working with their fungi, but they're not needing necessarily for that. Like garlic mustard doesn't need mycorrhizal association. I go to Germany and look at the forest and said, how have I not seen this before? They're in such bad shape, right? Leopold went over to Germany. What was that, in the 30s or something like that?
Yep.
Oh my God, what did the German foresters do? They just made all these conifer plantations. It's a disaster zone. I wasn't realizing that until I started learning how to read the woods here in North America and then going back and recognizing that.
Cool. Maybe this is a way to kind of encapsulate, because, you're one of those people that's had this broad experience. You've been able to look at all these things, and we're talking to foresters, or hopefully foresters are listening to us, or land managers are listening to us right now. So maybe a couple bigger questions, and we can take wherever you want. But based on what you know, based on where you've been, what you've seen, would you control garlic mustard? And if yes, then are there certain circumstances you might think about trying to control garlic mustard?
So the way that I describe that is, if you see one garlic mustard plant somewhere and there is no other garlic mustard plant a mile around, I have no problem with you ripping it out. Is it necessary? The answer is no. So we, on our property, have stopped doing anything about garlic mustard. And it's not because we want to be bad stewards. It's because we learned, but they're doing that, we're interfering with this process of the reduction of garlic mustard due to microbial communities. We don't do soil disturbance. We don't walk there. We don't trample on trillium seedlings or something else. But there's always a disturbance associated with you going in, pulling plants up, and then stepping on all the native plants that are still in there, right? So you're doing damage. So I would stop controlling garlic mustard, but it takes some patience and it takes some dedication to say, oh, I have a wall of garlic mustard and it's coming and it's growing out there, and seeing that wave just pass you by. Not everybody is made for that. The more successful managers that are thinking about the interests of an entire community, an entire forest, will let that wave pass through and do something that's more beneficial, like reducing deer numbers, for example.
What would your advice, Bernd, be for foresters, maybe like in our northern Wisconsin, where we don't have a lot of populations of garlic mustard yet, making that assessment on whether, should I try to control this or should I let it go at this point? Like, is there some kind of threshold or level that you would help them with that decision?
So if you see 10 garlic mustard plants and they have been there for 2 years, you're done. Can't do it. Okay, so people have tried. And I always say, I'm so dedicated. If I can't do it, I have a hard time imagining people being able to do it successfully. And that's kind of the experience, right? So garlic mustard doesn't go away with all the control efforts that people have thrown at it. So you talk about northern Wisconsin and what the foresters could do there. My advice, and it's not just for garlic mustard, it's for all kinds of other things that you don't like when they're non-native or weedy or whatever you want to call them, right? Undesirable plants in your woods. Make sure, and I don't know where the harvesting equipment comes from. If it comes from southern Wisconsin, make sure you have a washing station somewhere where you clean that equipment. Because we know that a lot of the undesirable plant species, weedy species, invasive species, are getting in the woods with our equipment. And that's the biggest transport. Some soil will have some seeds. That's the problem. Make sure you have clean equipment going from one forest patch to the next forest patch. It's some additional monetary effort. And I don't know how the contracting works there in northern Wisconsin, right? So here we have private foresters that come in, but in Wisconsin you have a lot of county and state forests, and so it's slightly different. So there may be different regulations that you have, or maybe the state or the counties own their own forestry operations. I don't fully understand that. You will know much better. So
yeah. So it sounds like maybe some take homes, and you can expand or add some to this, but one might be patient if you've got garlic mustard, but also be vigilant and be proactive in trying to, like you said, clean equipment or things like that.
Yeah. And so we see lots of other species in the woods go along hiking trails, go along game trails, right? There you see, that's the first introduction. So some of the people here in some of the parks and others have like boot scrubbing stations there. So you come in, you have some brushes, and you clean your boots. That's how things get around. Will it ultimately prevent it? I have my doubts. Will it slow it down? Yes. But if you have abundant seed sources all around, these things will get there over time. So unless the conditions are such that there is, people may call it biotic resistance, right? So you have an intact forest floor, no earthworms in there. Deer numbers are reasonably low. Leaf litter layers are thick. You have a full forest canopy. That may slow down a lot of the species that you don't find desirable in your woods. So maintaining good forest health, if you want to call it that way, goes a very long way of making your life easier instead of then requiring resources to manage something that you didn't want in the first place.
Yeah. I know I'm just thinking of my situations or places that I have been and tried to control garlic mustard and had those same results. And I think what you said, Brad, is having patience and maybe, as what you're saying, Bernd, enough willpower to maybe let things lie for a while and let those population dynamics happen. That's a difficult thing to do for a lot of managers.
But you guys are foresters. You should think in decades and hundreds of years, right?
Right.
So it should come naturally to the folks that are listening in to this, right? So they don't think in 3 years from now, the things that are planted 2 years ago, I can cut down and make whatever out. No, you cannot. You plan for the next generations of foresters, right? So I wanted to become a forester very early on. So my dream was, typical German dream. So you run around with your green stuff on, you have your dog by your side and a rifle over your shoulder, and you just look at everything. And when I then learned, well, a forester would basically go in and mark the trees to be cut down, said, I don't want to become a forester anymore.
Yeah.
I want my old trees. But nevertheless, so the time that you're thinking about should come, more natural to the foresters than the people that manage wetlands or grasslands or something of that sort. And what I have to warn about is garlic mustard will go through the places where it hasn't been yet. And I have sometimes described that as if you would throw a pebble in a pond, those waves that are radiating out, when the center is calm already, those waves will still ripple through the system. So where garlic mustard is not today, it will arrive, it will increase in abundance, and then decline. So you need to have that decadal thinking. Let it come, let it run its course, try to protect the native plants. That's the big thing. If you have desirable, whatever, trilliums or orchids or any other native wildflower, you need to protect those. But it's not protecting them from garlic mustard. It's protecting them from the deer that are eating them. That's the big thing. So, or your forest seedlings, right? Going back to the people that will listen in to this, they're thinking about tree growth. And I know that people in northern Wisconsin, when we work on a trophic cascade, is that we're trying to manage our cuts in a way that we overwhelm the deer that are there. So we actually have forest regenerating. And some people here in the area where I'm sitting in New York have the very same thing, although it's like one little property by one little property. 80% of New York forests are privately owned. It's very different than what you would have in northern Wisconsin, right? And so people not thinking on a landscape level can't manage deer on a landscape level. We just don't have the tools for that. But protecting those assets that you have is much more important than controlling garlic mustard.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Bernd, I'm sure you've given our foresters a lot to think on and contemplate. And certainly we do think in long time cycles. And so I think that's a really valuable lesson right there. So I really appreciate you coming out and talking with us today and kind of sharing your research and your thoughts with the foresters.
Thanks for having me. It has been an enjoyable little ride through various aspects.
Well, I guarantee there are foresters someplace that are pulled over right now going, wait, what did he just say? Because I think this will be the kind of thing that gets people thinking about some of this stuff. And even, plants the seed, like as we were talking, thinking about that idea of like you got some of these insights from both your land ownership, but those long-term monitoring plots and maybe long-term thinking with other invasive species is worth exploring as well, maybe in the same way.
Yeah, it is. Because what I'm worried about is that I don't think anybody has any bad intentions who wants to control garlic mustard. It's all coming out of a desire to help, right?
Right.
So that's what we see. Some people may not wanna or do not believe what I'm saying because they say, I've seen garlic mustard and it's never declined in my place. So I can't be there where they are living, where they are controlling. But what I'm suggesting is if you want to convince yourself or you want to look at it yourself, have some areas that you leave alone and see what's happening there, where there are other areas where you do your hand pulling. Try to convince yourself, but don't do everything everywhere. And you do not learn from either intervening or not intervening. We need to understand if we intervene, are we actually making life better for the things that we care about? And if we don't, we should question what we're doing. Right. So, I mean, your foresters are in the same thing. What are we doing? Do we do brush control? Do we do thinning? Do we use fire?
Yep.
They have an idea of what they want conceptually from the forest. I may not necessarily agree because I said I want more insects or more salamanders or more birds, but the foresters have an idea. This is what I want out of forest. These are the certain species that I want, and I want maybe maximize growth rates. And so you assess the different management intervention, whether they get you closer to what your goals are. So here I'm saying the very same thing for non-native plant control. Have some things where you look at it. Don't do everything the same way, but learn by doing. But it sometimes means not interfering.
Intelligent tinkering, Brad.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that's a completely different discussion. So, yep. No, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
This is a great conversation.
Thanks, Bernd. It was great talking to you today.
Thanks so much, Jude.
Well, that was a really interesting conversation, Brad. I think that's probably going to get a lot of people thinking.
I love the conversations where we kind of dig in.
Speaking of thinking,
yep.
I was thinking about...
You were thinking?
I was thinking.
All right.
I was thinking about our conversations this week around irregular shelter wood.
Oh.
Then I know we've talked about this in the past, but I think it's time for Silvictionary.
Yep. All right. I'm on the Silvosaurus. Let's go.
So in the past, we've talked about Femmelschlag being expanding gap, but in our conversation and things we've been looking at lately, there's a lot more to it than that. Femmelschlag was a really widely used term in Europe, and it seems like there are lots of systems.
I think that's right. If we only said that a Femmelschlag was expanding gaps, we would be doing a disservice, right?
Right.
We wouldn't be recognizing all those ways that it was used historically.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at stuff like in Patricia Raymond's piece from 2009, we've talked about the Bayer-Rischer Femmelschlag, which would have been maybe another name for expanding gap. I'm probably destroying that name. And then the Badischer Femmelschlag was more like the continuous cover, or that was also sometimes synonymous with the Swiss or Baden Femmelschlag.
That's a whole episode in and of itself, what continuous cover is.
Oh, man.
Or maybe what it isn't.
Well, I thought we could put that on Silvictionary, but I don't know if we could fit it in.
Ooh, that would be, yeah, we definitely have to have a drink for that one.
So I guess my main point to you was that it just really strikes me that maybe that conversation around those terms of irregular shelterwood, we need to go into more in the future because we just scratched the surface.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's really important to kind of take a look back at our own history with some of these things too. Because what really surprised me in looking through some of the information is that a group shelterwood, if you look back to some of the things like Smith and Professor Nyland, they're basically talking about expanding gaps. And they probably are doing it in a regular, not an irregular fashion. But it's not. It's everything. Once in a while, it's like we think that things are completely new, but no, it's maybe we just haven't really looked at them through the lens of maybe our own experience or our own guidance in the past that we probably skipped over.
Mm-hmm. So more conversation to come.
More to come
on some of that.
More to come.
If you're interested in that sort of thing. So we're going to assume people are interested because we're interested. And that's kind of the whole point of this show, right? Is we kind of just talk about stuff we're interested in.
Yes. Someday, Greg, though, we'll do SilviCast after hours where we'll really dig into the stuff that you really don't necessarily. Well, that might get an explicit rating, so we'll have to watch that one.
Yeah. Maybe later. Okay, let's close her on out, Brad.
Giddy up. Thanks for listening to today's episode of SilviCast. If you have ideas for future episodes, a question for us, whatever you want to send, just send them to us. Let us know. You can reach us at UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Please feel free to include a sound file of your question if you want. We can put you on the air with us if you like, or just send the question, right? But wouldn't it be cool to have a sound file?
They may not like that.
Oh, I think it would be really cool. And always remember, we learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
Take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team, Susan Barrett, our editor-in-chief, Joe Rogers, our IT master, theme music by Paul Frater and UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.